Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another stream of Skievers Idle Book Club. And we'll probably just have a short one tonight, since it's already after 8. And reading does make me super tired, so we'll just probably read a couple of chapters. But it's been quite a few weeks since we've actually done this, so I thought that I better get back into this. We're like almost halfway through the book. So we'll get a few more chapters done tonight and go from there. But let's start as always with our cookies. Just before I started, there's one. Just before I started the stream, there was a cookie, a golden cookie, as well as the one just now. So we did some clicks and we got some achievements. So in a minute, I will look at those achievements as soon as this frenzy is finished. But yeah, we'll click on this frenzy. Click, click, click. I can't click as fast as Sharky can, but I'm trying to click so we can get lots. I didn't actually see what the frenzy, what the times was. But yeah, we're getting like 788 million cookies, per second, per click, whatever. So this, I feel like it must be sort of high. I'm not sure. I'll have to have a look and see how many I get when I just click normally. Not that that will really be able to tell me. Unless it's like 1% or something. Yeah, so 112. Alright, so let's buy some 30 and then another 10 of that. 43. Alright, cookies all the way down and click again. So let's have a look at those stats. So that is this one, I believe. Cookies all the way down. Bake 100 trillion cookies. Nice. And click again that one. Make 10 trillion cookies from clicking. Nice. Nice, nice, nice. So, yeah. Let's do some more of these. 3. Oh, there's another golden cookie. Nice. 400 billion. Okay. Buy 10. Buy 10. Buy 10. Okay, I can only buy 2. Right. So, Eclipse cookies, zebra cookies, chocolate light, kitten engineers. I'm gonna avoid this one for a while. Stroop waffles, snickerdoodles, macaroons, madeleines, palmiers, palettes, sablés, illudium mouse, gingerbread men, gingerbread trees. Okay, alright. Well, let's leave that open and get into some reading. Okay. Chapter 15. Toril left Kiva. Oh, hang on. Sorry, hang on. I am doing the wrong thing. Sorry, everyone. I'm about to continue reading. But I had one of the old streams playing instead of the live stream. So, okay. Chapter 15. Tora left Kiva at the Tippled Boar after making her promise not to return to Oak Hollow, claiming the risk of discovery was too great. In return, Kiva handed back Zuleika's mask and agreed to send any messages through the innkeeper before giving her brother a warm hug goodbye. Lucinda found her in the tavern's courtyard shortly afterward and maintained a mostly one-sided conversation on the ride back to Valenia. By the time they dismounted outside Silverthorn's stables, the sun was dropping below the horizon. Sensing Kiva's anxiety, Rest shooed her away. "I'm here every day for the morning shift. Come find me if you want a break from palace life," the healer invited. "We can get choco buns." "Sounds perfect," Kiva said before taking off down the hill and hurrying along the river road, reaching the palace in record time. She'd barely unfastened her cloak when an angry knock sounded at the door to her room. Kiva froze, a million fears hitting her all at once. What if someone had seen her leave the city? What if they'd followed her to Oak Hollow? What if she'd been spotted in the rebel camp? What if the mask hadn't fooled them? What if... Kiva, I know you're in there. I heard you come back. The breath whooshed out of her as she opened the door to find Tip standing there, his freckled face set in a frown. "You've been gone all day." There was no denying the accusation in his tone, but Kiva was unsure why it was there. "I went to Silverthorn." Not a lie, and yet she still hated herself for the half-truth. "I wanted to show you what Ori and I did in art class today, and you weren't here," Tip cried. "I always know where to find you, and I couldn't." Kiva suddenly understood why he was so upset. For 3 years, Tip had been able to seek her out any time he'd needed her. At Zalendov, she'd always been in the infirmary. At the Winter Palace, they'd barely left each other's sides, as they'd acclimatized to their new freedom. Even when they'd reached Valenia, Kiva had never disappeared for as many hours in a row as she had today. Tip had missed her. Tears touched the back of her eyes as she took in his fiery distress, but she didn't want to embarrass him, so she blinked them away and said, "I'm sorry, I lost track of time. Would you like to show me now?" His anger was immediately replaced by eagerness as he tugged her into the sitting room. On an easel near the window was a canvas covered by a sheet, and Tip quickly whipped it off, revealing what lay beneath. "It's us," he declared proudly, pointing at the portrait. The tears Kiva had swallowed back returned with a vengeance at the sight of what the young boy had created. The brush strokes were imperfect and the colors were eccentric, but Kiva could easily recognize herself in the painting, her dark hair floating in the breeze, her emerald eyes comically wide. One of her hands held a red-headed, freckled-faced boy who was beaming widely, and her other hand... "That's me, you and Jaren," Tip said. Then he shared a long-winded story about how the art tutor had asked him to paint how he saw his future. Kiva had to tune him out, her heart aching as she took in the rest of the portrait's details. Kiva's other hand was entwined with Jaren's, the two of them smiling at each other, the river palace in the background, and crowns on their heads. Both of their heads. In the distance were the blurred figures of Oriel, Mirren, Calden, Nari, Queen Ariana, and a man Kiva assumed was King Stellan. Even Phlox was in the painting, curled up on Jaren's feet. It was a family portrait, created by an 11-year-old who had been asked to paint his future. And then she said the grass shouldn't be purple, and I reminded her that she said to use my imagination, and what's more imaginative than purple grass? Tip finally paused to take a breath before looking at Kiva and waiting for her verdict. She felt as if pins were stabbing into her tongue, but she somehow managed to force out the words, "It's perfect." The gap-toothed grin he sent her lit up the room. She couldn't resist wrapping her arms around him, partly to keep him from seeing the devastation on her face, and partly just so she could feel him in her arms, safe and alive. He would never have the future he envisioned, but she was darn well going to make sure he had a future, and that no matter what happened in the coming days, he wouldn't be left on his own. Tip would always have a home at the palace, regardless of who it was with. She would make sure of it. Sorry, am I interrupting? I can come back. Kiva glanced up to find Jaren standing in the doorway, his hair messy enough to indicate he'd been running his hands through it all day. His clothes rumpled. He looked like he hadn't slept in weeks, but instead of making him less attractive, those flaws only made him more real, more human, more... She gave herself a firm mental slap. Kiva released Tip, and when the young boy ran over to greet Jaren, quickly covered the painting. Jaren, Tip yelled, crash tackling him on approach. Do you want to come and see? How are your meetings? Kiva quickly interrupted. Long, Jaren said, sighing when Phlox ran into the room and collapsed on top of his feet. How was Silverthorn? She was gone all day, Tip shared, repeating his earlier accusations. There was no anger in his voice this time, his attention wholly focused on unlatching Fox's claws from Jaren's leather boots so he could pull the fluffy creature into his arms. Jaren's golden brows rose. All day, you must be tired. Pot, kettle, Kiva said, gesturing to his disheveled appearance. Today was challenging, Jaren said. He looked as if he were about to say more, but then changed his mind and shared, if you two don't have any other plans, everyone is free tonight for the first time since we returned home. Are you up for a family dinner? Kiva's stomach tightened, but Tip offered an excited, yeah. Go wash up, kiddo, Jaren said, tipping his chin toward Tip's bedroom. We'll wait for you. Tip handed the disgruntled Phlox to Jaren, the creature's mood brightening at the instant he was put in the prince's hands, and took off to his room. Should I, Kiva waved to her outfit, fearing her clothes were too casual for dinner with the royal family. Jaren's eyes didn't wander from her face, his tone soft as he said, You're perfect just as you are. His implication was impossible to miss. Kiva's breath caught, but she was saved from having to respond when Tip skipped back and declared, Ready! If Kiva had been asked to recall anything about their walk across the Western Palace, she wouldn't have been able to answer, not with Jaren's words repeating in her mind like a feather stroking her skin. You're perfect, just as you are. Part of her was furious with him as they stepped into the small, intimate dining room where his family waited. How dare he be so kind, so loving, so Jaren? Why couldn't he act like the haughty prince he should have been? More like his sister. Heck, even more like flirtatious Calden, who Kiva felt a growing fondness toward, but whose personality acted like a romantic repellent. You're perfect, just as you are. Kiva wanted to cry. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and ignored how good it felt to have Jaren's hand resting against her back, guiding her into the room. A quick glance revealed that an ornate ashwood table lay at the center of the space, already set and brimming with food. Carved meats and roasted vegetables, sauces of gravy, cheese platters, thick, luscious breads, and a whole host of other delicacies that made Kiva's mouth water just looking at them. Interspersed between the golden plates was a trail of dainty luminium drops, the speckles of light making the buffet look almost magical, especially when combined with the crystal vases full of snow blossoms. In the background, the floor-to-ceiling windows looked straight out to the manicured gardens, a sight that was beautiful at night and would be even more spectacular during the day. As phenomenal as the display was, Kiva couldn't appreciate it as much as it deserved, not when the royal family turned as one to look at her, Jaren and Tip, upon their entry into the room. Anxiety swept Kiva over, but Tip was immune to the attention. Bounding straight over to the spare seat beside the grinning Oriole, the two boys immediately bent their heads together and began whispering in a way that would have alarmed Kiva at any other time, but she was too focused on staying calm as Jaren nudged her towards the head of the table. I don't believe you've met my father yet, he said, as the middle-aged, well-dressed man rose from his seat on their approach. The king of Volenia stood up for Kiva. I've heard so much about you, King Stellan said, reaching for her hand. Her fingers felt numb, but his grip was gentle as he closed both of his hands around hers and smiled warmly. He had Jaren's smile, and that wasn't all they shared. The king's hair was darker than the rest of his family, like a rich caramel, which explained the brown shades that blended through Jaren's golden locks. Stellan's eyes were also different, being a coppery color, unlike the blue that his wife and children shared, with a gold rim that had been inherited only by Jaren. Tall, broad shoulders, honeyed skin, aside from the hair and eyes, he was what Kiva envisioned that Jaren would look like in 20 years. It wasn't a bad image, at all. And yet, there was something Kiva couldn't quite put her finger on, a wanness to his face, a strain about his features, a dullness in his eyes. She wouldn't have given it any further thought, except that as his hands held hers, she felt it. The king was sick. Kiva knew it in every part of her. Her magic knew it. Her fingers, no longer numb, starting to tingle. No, she screamed inwardly. If ever there was a place she absolutely could not lose control of her power, it was a room filled with almost the entire Valentis family. So she shoved it down, deeper and deeper, just as she had with Racinda, praying with everything inside her that the golden glow wouldn't burst forth. Because if it did, she was dead. Her head ached from the effort, her stomach knotted painfully, her bones felt like they were melting, but when the king finally released her hand, her skin looked exactly as it should. Kiva's relief was so intense that her knees wobbled, but she made herself return Stellan's smile and say, "It's an honor to meet you, your majesty." The king waved a hand in the air. "Please, we don't stand on ceremony in this family." He leaned in, a twinkle in his eyes, especially among friends. His gaze flicked from Kiva to Jaren, his emphasis prompting warmth to touch her cheeks. Gosh, she hoped the royal council hadn't spoken with Stellan, especially Councilwoman Zera, or Queen Ariana, since she'd also heard every word down in the tunnels. One of them began another conversation about intentions at dinner. If one of them began another conversation about intentions at dinner, Kiva might very well die of embarrassment. "Why don't you sit by me?" Stellan said, pulling the chair out for her. "I want to hear all about the extraordinary young woman who survived a decade in—" "I was thinking we could tell Kiva and Tip more about our family," Jaren cut in smoothly. "Share some stories, let them get to know us a little better." Kiva sent him a grateful look, knowing he'd sensed her growing tension and had swiftly intervened. "Family stories?" Caldon spoke up from where he sat next to Mirren, a devious grin stretching across his face. He raised his goblet and tipped it toward Kiva. "You're in for a treat, sunshine. I have dirt on everyone at this table. Prepare to be entertained." "Caldon, dearest, I don't think—" Ariana started, but was interrupted by the arrival of Nari and Captain Verus. Kiva's heart gave a panicked thump, as she again feared that someone had discovered her true outing that day. But then she saw that the guard and captain were in casual clothes, their stances relaxed. "Sorry we're late," Nari said, taking the empty seat beside Caldon. "We were working drills with some of the new recruits." "How are they looking?" Stellan asked. Jaren nudged the stiff Kiva into the seat. The king was still holding out for her. Once she was settled, he sat to her right. His father reclaimed the spot angled at the head of the table to her left, and Captain Verus took the seat directly opposite her. Nerves prickled Kiva as the captain gave a quick nod of greeting? Respect? She wasn't sure. She made herself take a deep breath, calling to mind everything Jaren had said to the council during the council meeting, how Varys remembered her from 10 years ago, but Cowden hadn't discovered anything incriminating in his investigation. To them, she was only Kiva Meriden. Her true identity remained safe. "It's a cocky lot this year," the captain answered the king. "They're good, and they know it, but we'll whip them into shape." Kiva must have made an alarm sound, because as everyone started to fill their plates, Jaren leaned in and said, "He's talking figuratively. We don't whip our guards." "No, just make them run training drills over and over until their eyes bleed from sheer boredom," Cowden said dryly, buttering a slice of bread. "What are the 3 qualities that make a good royal guard?" Ferris asked, looking around Nari at Cowden, his salt and pepper hair shining under the aluminium chandelier. "Oh dear gosh," the rakish prince murmured, reaching for his wine. "I'm going to need something much stronger than this." "Discipline," Varys said, ticking off his fingers. "Discipline and discipline." "That's only one thing," Cowden said, "as I keep telling you every time you say it." "Maybe one day you'll remember what it means," Varys shot back. "At least I can count to 3, Cowden mumbled, refilling his drink and gulping more down. "All right, children, no fighting on family night," Queen Ariana chided, though her eyes danced as she looked between Cowden and Varys, the latter of whom was older than she and therefore hardly considered a child. But Kiva was stuck on the word she'd used. Family night. Feeling queasy, she reached for her own goblet, a light sniff revealing it to be mulled apple juice. She took a large sip just as Oriel bounced in his seat and turned to the captain. "Captain Varys!" Uncle Varys. Kiva nearly spat out her juice. "Mother says I can start training with you when I turn 12. Can Tip join us?" "I don't see why not," Varys answered, spearing some beans with his fork, "as long as you both take it seriously." "We will," Oriel said, with Tip nodding eagerly beside him. Kiva, however, couldn't keep from looking at Varys and wheezing out, "Uncle?" The captain's brown eyes lit with humour, making it clear he hadn't missed her shocked reaction. "Not by blood." "Varys and I grew up together," King Stellan told Kiva, passing her a bowl of roasted potatoes. "My parents died from the river fever when I was young, so Varys and his family took me in. When he became a recruit with the Royal Guard, he invited me to his graduation ceremony, and that's where I met the love of my life." The Queen blushed at the way Stellan looked at her, before taking up the story. "My parents weren't thrilled that I was being courted by a young man without title or rank, and an orphan no less. Varys had to get creative in helping us sneak out to see each other. If not for him, who knows where we might all be today." "Ari's parents eventually realized that I was a catch," Stellan told Kiva with a satisfied smile. "And we lived happily ever after." The words settled heavily in the room. Tip and Oriel were oblivious, stuffing their faces and giggling as they snuck scraps to flocks beneath the table. But everyone else, they knew the king was sick, that his happily ever after was coming to an end. Clearing her throat, Kiva acted as if she couldn't feel the sadness that had come over the table. "That's a lovely story," she said. "It is, isn't it?" Cowden said with mock disgust. He speared some glazed pork and pointed it at Kiva. "But I promised you entertainment, so it's my turn to share a tale now, and I know just the one." Cowden, Kiva quickly realized, wasn't just a pain in the backside. He was a smart pain in the backside. He read the room, sensed the mood, and understood that something was needed to lighten the atmosphere. She wondered how often he did it, his attention-seeking used as a means to distract his family when they needed it most. She considered it further as she ate her meal, listening to him recount the details of a diplomatic trip he and Jaren had taken to the desert kingdom of Hadris in the far west of Wenderall. The moment he'd begun the story, Jaren had groaned quietly and begun shoveling food into his mouth to avoiding Kiva's eyes. She knew why when Caldon came to the end of his tale. And of course he had no idea I'd spiked his drink, but if anyone needed to get sloshed after 14 straight hours of fending off arranged marriages, it was our Jaren. How was I supposed to know he wouldn't sleep it off like a normal person, but instead he'd go running into the midnight markets and dance until dawn? It didn't happen quite like that, Jaren said dryly. And as I recall, I wasn't the only one who went to those markets. Calden didn't seem to hear him. They still call you the Pantsless Prince to this very day, he said, grinning widely. It's better than what they call you, cousin, Mirren cut in with a smirk on her face. Kiva looked at Calden. What do they... Nothing, he said quickly, stuffing his mouth with carrots. He repeated, absolutely nothing. Only it came out as more of a absolutely nothing. The look he shot both Jaren and Mirren made it clear there would be consequences if they dared to answer. Deciding to play nice, the princess launched into a new story, one from when she, Jaren, and Calden were children. The three of them had snuck out of the palace one night, having overheard a diplomat from Nerine talking about visiting a red house before travelling back to his kingdom. In their innocence, they'd assumed he meant a literal red-coloured house, so they'd followed him to the docks. What they'd seen... We were grounded for a month, Mirren shared. But not because we snuck out, because of how embarrassed Nerine's royal ambassador was when he found us all in our wide-eyed horror and had to return us to our parents. I'll never forget how red his cheeks were when he stammered out about how important it was for him to experience all the hidden depths of our culture. He definitely wanted to explore hidden depths, but we all know he didn't give a darn about our culture, Calden murmured into his goblet. Calden, Ariana scolded him. As if you weren't thinking it, Aunt. The Queen didn't comment, instead breaking off some bread and dipping it in oil. Who has another story? Perhaps one that doesn't involve humiliation. Humiliating stories are the best, though, Calden said, reclining in his chair. Mirren seemed to agree, since she returned his devious look and asked, Do you remember Jaren being accosted by those courtiers when we stayed at the palace in Lyras? Jaren made a distressed sound. Someone kill me, right now. The princess grinned wickedly and went on to share about a fanatic group of men and women who refused to so much as let Jaren feed himself while he was in their kingdom. It's an offense to say no to Valornian hospitality, Mirren told Kiva with clear mirth. Poor Jaren is adored just a little too much by our Western allies. Kiva snickered along with everyone else, even as she heard Jaren's quiet sigh. When she glanced at him, his eyes were lit with self-depreciating humor, telling her that no matter how embarrassed he might be, he wasn't going to ruin his family's fun. However, after everyone else started jumping in with their own memories, he finally reached breaking point. How did I not know about that one? Calden asked, roaring with laughter at a tale Oriel had just shared, involving a seaside vacation and a kindly old woman who had been convinced Jaren was her long-lost grandchild. Maybe it's so I could avoid delightful moments like this, Jaren returned. He looked around the table. Please, for the love of all, someone share something that doesn't involve me. I have a story. Just pause that for a minute. Sorry about that, everybody. Maybe it's so I could avoid delightful moments like this. Jaren returned. He looked round the table. Please, for the love of all, someone share something that doesn't involve me. I have a story, Captain Verus said, pushing his empty plate away. It's about a tenacious teenager who escaped from a Javaran arena, crossed the Forsaken Lands with nothing but the swords on her back, navigated the deadly underground streets of Ursa. Then finally... stowed away on an Avalonian vessel returning to Valenia. He sent a fatherly wink to Nari. All of that you already know, but I've never shared what happened immediately after I found this one. He jerked his thumb at the guard, spewing over the side of the ship. Varys launched into a boisterous tale about how he'd first met Nari, and how she'd convinced him to take her under his wing rather than toss her to the sharks. His detailed account had the royals laughing, and Nari rolling her eyes, but Kiva only half listened, unable to shake what Varys had said in his introduction. Nari had fought in one of Skievers' notorious arenas. Kiva had learned rumors about them, enough to know that while they weren't sorry about that. I got a really bad tickle in my throat. That while they weren't always a death sentence like Valandov, anyone sent to an arena came out as one of two types of people, a warrior or a corpse. Not only that, but Nari had escaped and then crossed the Forsaken Lands alone. Kiva had already respected the guard for all she'd overcome in her short life, not the least of which was losing her hand after protecting Jaren from an attack. But now Kiva's esteem for the young woman grew considerably, as did her concern. Nari would die before she let anything happen to Jaren, not just because it was her job to protect him, but also because her being there tonight at a family dinner meant she wasn't just a guard to the royals, golden shield or not. If she sensed even a hint of betrayal, Kiva knew Nari wouldn't hesitate to end her, no matter what bond had grown between them. Her food settling uncomfortably in her stomach, Kiva turned back into the conversation, just as Nari took over from Varys, sharing a part of the story that left him chuckling with embarrassment and denying every word. The king piped up with gleeful confirmation, adding his own details, causing the table to laugh anew. And from there they continued, each of them sharing moments from their lives, sometimes joyous, sometimes humiliating, sometimes simply revealing parts of their histories, doing exactly what Jarrett had requested upon their arrival in the room, letting Kiva and Tip get to know them. With each new story, Kiva died a little more on the inside. Outwardly she smiled along with everyone else, but inwardly she couldn't stand what was happening. The Valentis family was so normal. But not just normal. They loved each other so deeply it was evident in every word they spoke, in every glance they shared, in every comedic insult and every soothing compliment. And it wasn't just the royals. They behaved the same way toward Varys and Nari. Heck, even to Kiva and Tip. Everything about them promoted inclusivity, acceptance, and such a tender affection that Kiva felt as if a vice was squeezing her chest. I'm tired of seeing good people suffer for a cause I'm not even sure I believe in. Toral's voice returned to Kiva, his statement resonating so strongly in her. And then she heard Jaren's voice. You're perfect, just as you are. She wasn't, though. She was far from perfect. And one day soon he would know. And he would hate her. The thought left Kiva struggling to draw air into her lungs. But she made herself continue to smile. as he and his family went out of their way to make sure she and Tip felt included. Kiva had never hated herself more than she did that night, and she knew the feeling wasn't going to leave her anytime soon. Perhaps never. Chapter 16. Oh wait, hang on, let me do this. So Sharky doesn't say, "You didn't do that." Okay. 193. Okay, we've got 5% more and then we're halfway through. Chapter 16. Unsurprisingly, Kiva couldn't sleep that night. After dinner ended, she tossed and turned in bed, guilt and shame keeping her awake until she finally donned a silk robe and left her room. Given that it was the dead of night, Kiva didn't see anyone as she ventured along the golden white corridors, and she expected to reach. She she didn't expect that to change when she reached her destination. But upon entering the river room, she found she wasn't alone. Jaren stood beside the window wall, looking out over the Saren River, blissfully unaware of her presence. Wearing only loose-fitting long pants, the low light revealed the scars marring his back, all of which Kiva had seen before, many times. Only 2 nights earlier she'd felt them beneath her hands as he'd comforted her in her bed. But looking at them now, pain lanced through her. The thought of anyone hurting Jaren, the butcher, his mother, anyone, causing her both physical and emotional distress. Wars aren't won without sacrifice, little sister. Sulika's harsh words blazed across Kiva's memory. It's him or us. Them or us. You can't have it both ways. Kiva closed her eyes, certain of only one thing. She was going to hurt Jaren. She would be the reason something horrible happened to him. And she couldn't let that happen. But she also couldn't stop it. Staring at him, Kiva felt like she was being ripped in two. On one side of her was her dedication to her family and their cause, and on the other was Jaren, but also Caldon, and Nari, young Oriel and Phlox, even Princess Mirren and Queen Ariana and King Stellan, the whole Valentis family. The Captain Varus Kiva wasn't sure about yet, but despite him being there the night her family was destroyed, it wasn't his sword that had killed her brother. She still remembered his growled words. This wasn't meant to happen. This never should have happened. Without her permission, these people had worked their way into her heart, forcing her to see them, not as royals and gods, but as human beings, as a family. For 10 years, all she'd wanted was to ruin the family that had ruined hers. But now that she knew them, I'm tired of seeing good people suffer for a cause I'm not even sure I believe in. Toral's words were going to haunt her. She was sure of it. Unable to withstand her troubled heart, Kiva backed away silently, not wanting to disturb Jaren, and risk whatever new kindness he would offer her, her very own form of torture. But some sixth sense made him look over his shoulder, his body stilling as he caught sight of her, before relaxing again. Couldn't sleep? He asked, leaving the window wall and walking her way. Looks like I'm not the only one, Kiva returned, her voice hoarse with all she was feeling. Come and sit with me for a bit, Jaren asked, nodding to the plush lounge. I could use the company. Peering at him closely, Kiva could see he wasn't lying. The earlier strain had returned to his features, a deep weariness mixed liberally with unease. You can get to him in a way no one else can. Learn things about him, about his plans, and about where he's most vulnerable. Zuleika's words from days ago returned to Kiva, her inner turmoil growing because she knew what she needed to do. Moving slowly over to him, she sat on the far edge of the couch and prompted, "You look like you have the weight of the world on your shoulders." She'd left him plenty of room, but when Jaren sighed loudly and took a seat beside her, he was close enough for their arms to brush. "Want to tell me about it?" Kiva offered, part of her wishing he would say no. But he didn't, because he was Jaren, and he trusted her. So he shared, "The Royal Council is concerned about a threat to the kingdom." "The rebels?" Kiva asked, playing dumb. "No," Jaren said. "Well, yes, but also no." Kiva waited for him to go on, even if, thanks to her eavesdropping, she knew what he would say. "The rebels have been quiet since Tilda's death," he said, with a quick apologetic look, knowing how much Tilda had meant to her as a patient. "They're still causing some trouble, but nothing like before the winter, aside from their attempt to abduct you, which we can only assume was to remind us that they're out there." He paused and shared, "There are rumors Tilda left behind an heir, old enough to take over, maybe more than one. We won't know for sure until they restart their attacks." He blew out a long, frustrated breath before rolling the tension from his neck. "So until that happens, for the first time in years, they're not my main concern." "But something is troubling you," Kiva observed, still acting oblivious. "It has been since we arrived here, with you locked in meetings and looking more and more miserable after each one." "Miserable?" Jaren repeated, a hint of humour touching his eyes. An easy comparison came to Kiva, like how Phlox looks when he can't follow you somewhere. That kind of miserable. Instead of adding to his mirth, Jaren's hand quickly covered her mouth. "Shh! Don't say his name, or you'll wake the clingy devil." A tilt of his chin over to the window revealed the fluffy creature asleep on the ground, right where Jaren had been standing. As they watched, Phlox's eyes fluttered open, his head popping up fast once he realized he was alone, a mewing sound of distress leaving his mouth, but then he turned and looked their way, his little silver face brightening as he bounded over to them. Jaren groaned as Phlox leapt straight onto his lap. Curled up again and was snoring softly a moment later. "I blame you for this." Biting back a laugh, she combed her fingers through Phlox's soft fur. "It's not my fault you're so irresistible." At first, Kiva didn't realize what she said, but then she noticed Jaren had gone still beside her, and she mentally replayed the words. "Irresistible, huh?" he teased, his eyes dancing. Kiva tried to rally. It was either that, or jump out the window and drown herself in the Seren. You know, a fox thing? If anything, Jaren's amusement only grew. "A fox thing? Ferret? Raccoon? I have no idea what he is." Jaren chuckled. "He's a silver bear." Squinting at the dozing creature, Kiva observed, "He looks nothing like a bear." "I didn't come up with the name," Jaren said, still grinning. "They're rare, only found in the wilds of Odon's northern mountains. Phlox was a gift from their king and queen." "To Oriel?" "To me," sheepishly he added. "More a bribe than anything else." "Let me guess," Kiva said dryly. "They have an air of marriageable age." Jaren didn't meet her eyes, which was confirmation enough. Ori was lonely at the time, there weren't many kids around the palace, and Mary, Cal, Ash, and I were also busy with politics and training. When Phlox arrived, I gave him to my brother, and they became fast friends. And yet he's much more obsessed with you, she noted. I hear it's because I'm irresistible. The look Jaren sent Kiva made her want to jump out the window all over again. Clearing her throat, she returned to the earlier topic. "Before we were interrupted," she stroked Phlox's spine, "you were talking about a threat to the kingdom." Jaren was silent for a long time, long enough for Kiva to wonder if he'd changed his mind about sharing. But then he said, "Do you remember what I told you in Zalendov about the other kingdoms fearing the rebel movement will spread into their lands, how in some cases it already had?" Kiva bit her cheek and nodded. Do you remember what else I said? Jaren asked. About Miravan and Caramel, waiting for any sign of weakness? You think they're going to invade? She asked, feigning concern. Not that she wasn't concerned. Something is stirring up north, Jaren said, not quite answering. There have always been warnings, threats, the usual. But something has changed recently, from around the time we started negotiating with Miravan for Tilda's transfer into our custody. They were so difficult, refusing to accept any of our terms, no matter how generous. That last part was news to Kiva, and she straightened beside him. I've only learned about most of this since leaving Dalendorf, he went on. And it doesn't make sense to me. We offered them some things they've wanted for a long time, including greater access to our aluminium stores and looser restrictions for border crossings, both of which would hurt our economy while boosting theirs. But they weren't interested. A strange feeling came over Kiva, and she flattened her free hand against her suddenly churning stomach, recalling her sister's words from earlier that day. King Narvok was more than happy to make a deal with the rebel queen. In return, he only had to make it, so the negotiations between kingdoms resolved with her heading to Thalendorf. Kiva had been so caught up in everything else that she hadn't thought to question the deal Tilda had proposed in return for Miravan turning down Avalon's request for an extradition agreement. But now Kiva couldn't help wondering, what had her mother offered? What had she done? The council fears what their lack of cooperation means, especially since they're no longer answering any of our missives, Jaren said. The same goes for Caramel. Both kingdoms have always envied Avalon. Our lands are rich and prosperous, while theirs are largely barren. They have never hidden their desire to invade us, but with the Tenestra mountains in their path, and our armies prepared to meet any attacking force, they've always been too smart to try. Now, though, I can't help thinking they've decided it's worth the risk, especially while we're distracted by our internal troubles with the rebels. Throat dry, Kiva asked. Then isn't it good that the rebels are quiet right now, because you're not distracted? Jaren nodded, but he didn't seem convinced. Why do you still look so concerned? Kiva asked. It's just... Jaren ran a hand through his hair, the golden ends sticking out all over the place. I love my people too much not to worry about them. It's an intrinsic part of who I am, wanting to keep them safe, so I don't like the idea of any threat looming over us, even if I'm confident of our own defenses. Kiva couldn't help from raising an eyebrow. You're the heir to the richest land in Wenderol. You're always going to have threats looming over you. Jaren made a sound that was part laugh, part groan. Believe me, I know. He then straightened his shoulders and said, even if Miravan and Caramel decide to try, they won't make it very far into Avalon. We have too many defenses blocking them. It's a fool's errand, and that's the only reason I'm able to sleep at night. When Kiva turned skeptically toward the darkened windows, Jaren amended, well, most nights. So you're worried in general, but not about anything specific, she summarized. I'm worried about plenty of specific things, Jaren looked at Phlox and added somewhat dryly, like whether I'll ever be able to leave this couch. Such a conundrum, Kiva teased. Jaren smiled, but then he quickly sobered. Speaking of leaving, I meant to tell you earlier, but we got distracted by the most humiliating dinner of my existence. Kiva snickered in memory. I'm leaving for Falarian in the morning, he continued. The city leaders want to discuss infrastructure and farming, and a number of other things that need overseeing. I'll be gone for at least 4 days, possibly more. Oh, Kiva said, secretly delighted. If Jaren was gone, he wouldn't notice if she went missing for a few hours. And after another near miss with her magic tonight, she was more desperate than ever to find her grandmother. Well, thanks for telling me. I was going to invite you along, he said, but I'd rather not be responsible for you dying of boredom. I appreciate that, Kiva said, shuddering inwardly as she recalled the second half of the Royal Council meeting. I also heard you've been offered a position at Silverthorn. Jaren added, and I didn't want to risk pulling you away from your dream. He leaned closer, his expression filling with pride. Congratulations, Kiva. Right now she deserves the chance to live her life and follow her dreams. Her chest tightened as she remembered the words, I haven't accepted yet. I heard that too, Jaren cocked his head to the side. I'm just not sure why. Kiva swallowed. I just want to make sure I'm ready first. Hila Mattis says you are. That wasn't what Kiva meant by ready. She only says that because of my father. She knew him? He asked, surprised. You told me he was a healer. Did he study at Silverthorn? Sort of, Kiva hedged. Mattis said he was one of her best students. She knew better than to give Jaren more of her family history. He already knew too much for comfort. And yet, he'd still defended Farron to the Royal Council. Kiva, too, by association. Like father, like daughter, Jaren said, looking at her warmly and sliding a comforting arm behind her shoulders. Kiva couldn't speak for a long moment, his words resonating deeply. It was true. She was like her father. She had his healer's heart, his compassion for people, and long ago she'd had his eternal optimism. But then Zalandov had happened, and Farron had been taken away from her. In all the time since then, she'd become so obsessed with vengeance that she hadn't stopped to think about what he would have wanted. For her, for their family. Or perhaps she hadn't considered it because she already knew the answer. Farron would have wanted them to forgive and to move on. He would have wanted them to chase their dreams, to be happy, to live. He wouldn't have wanted them bent on revenge. He would have just wanted them safe. And deep down, Kiva knew he would be turning in his grave if he knew what his children were up to. Speaking of fathers, Kiva said, croaking slightly and needing to not think about her own. She settled deeper into the lounge, unintentionally leaning into Jaren. King Stellan, is he what? In a whisper, Kiva asked. Is he sick? Jaren froze beside her, but then his arm curled tighter, either to comfort himself or to comfort her as he breathed out a quiet, yeah. Is it terminal? Kiva said, whispering. Jaren nodded. It's in his blood. His free hand smoothed Flox's ears as he shared. There's been more bad days than good lately. That's why you didn't meet him before tonight. He's been in bed all week. Softly, Kiva asked. How long does he have? We don't know, Jaren admitted just as softly. Could be years, but most likely months, possibly weeks. There's nothing you can do? Shaking his head, Jaren said, We've tried everything. Now we just keep him as comfortable as possible. Seeing the raw pain on his face, Kiva erased the last of the distance between them, resting her head on his shoulder and wrapping her arm around his stomach, being careful not to dislodge Phlox. She knew it wasn't wise, that she should keep her distance, physically and emotionally. She knew, but she didn't care. Not when Jaren was upset. Not when he needed her. I'm sorry, she whispered. In response, he placed a soft kiss on her temple. Silence fell between them, long enough for Kiva to decide it was time to return to her room. Just as she was about to do so, her eyes drifted shut and she descended into sleep. Oops, I'm not even clicking on it. What a waste. And then I have to look because I also did get an achievement that I saw. Okay, there we go. Which was this one, maybe? Bake 1 million cookies per second. Or was it this one? This one, I think. Fortune. Click 77 golden cookies. Cool. Let's buy. Oh, I can do the basics. Rude. Road. Oh, that gave me a shiver. I probably should save up. Let's do this. I've done 16. And 203. 47%. Oh, there's a golden cookie. There's a golden cookie. Well, let me just quickly see how long this next chapter is, because when I got that tickle in my throat earlier, it's given me a really scratchy throat. 10 pages. Alright, we might read one more chapter, and then I will wrap it up, because I have a scratchy throat, which is very frustrating. Chapter 17. When Kiva woke the next morning, she was in her bed, the blankets snug around her. She cast her mind back and realized Jaren must have carried her to her room and tucked her into bed. A mortified groan left her, but then a hard knock on her door had her shooting upwards, with Cowden calling through the wood a moment later to say it was time for training. The last thing she wanted to do that morning was work on her fitness, not when she was so anxious to find Nana Deloria. But knowing the prince would hunt her down if she tried to skip their session, Kiva tried to change into her training clothes. I hate dawn, she said, upon meeting him in her sitting room. Good morning to you too, sunshine, Cowden returned, tweaking her nose. She pulled a face and followed him outside, whinging all the way, as if to punish her sour attitude. He made her do double the amount of box steps, and added an extra 2 running laps, leaving her in agony, but also feeling proud of herself when she only vomited once. I think I'm getting better at this, Kiva panted after they finished their final lap. We're not done yet, sweet cheeks, Cowden said, his breath perfectly steady. Kiva was about to object, partly because she was exhausted, and partly because she wanted to get to Blackwater Bog, find her grandmother, and return to the palace before anyone realized she'd been gone. But then Cowden revealed 2 wooden swords, and her excitement at holding a weapon, childproof or not, made her swallow her complaint. You're not ready for real steel, the prince told her, but we can start practicing some basic forms, getting you used to the feel of it in your hands, and building on your core strength. Kiva tossed the blade from hand to hand. It's a bit light, isn't it? Mirth filled Cowden's expression. Let's see if you're saying that when you finish. Kiva was naively confident when he guided her through some introductory moves, reminding her to retain the correct posture he'd been drilling into her for days. He kept his own wooden blade sheathed, making her slice into the air, her abdominal muscles squeezing as she turned her hips at his command, thrusting and parrying with snail speed. It's all about control and balance, Cowden told her, with a heck of a lot of repetition. Within minutes, Kiva's muscles were burning, all of them. At any one time, she had to be in complete control of her body, while still listening carefully to Cowden's merciless corrections. Look up, back straight, watch your feet, slow down, tighten your core. Toward the end, he ordered her to speed up, forcing her into a set of quick steps, lunges, and constant footwork that demanded perfect balance and concentration. When he finally said she could stop, she wasn't only physically shattered, but mentally too. That wasn't terrible, Cowden said, looking down at Kiva, who had collapsed, a spread eagle on the ground. But we have a lot of work to do, Kiva whimpered. Would you care if I told you the only part of me that doesn't hurt is my hair? I'd care, Cowden answered. He grinned and added, because as long as any part of you doesn't hurt, it means I need to push you harder tomorrow. Kiva didn't have the energy to reply, or cry, which is what she really felt like doing. Never before had she been more grateful for Racinda's quick-acting muscle relaxant powder that was waiting in her room. If only she could summon the strength to get there. All right, sweet cheeks, I'll help you out just this once, Cowden said, hauling her to her feet. You're too kind, Kiva groused. or she tried to, but her words ended in a pain-filled groan as she sought to keep her legs from crumpling beneath her. Usually, yes, Calden agreed, but today is also for self-serving reasons. With you, it usually is. Be nice, Calden said, or I won't play tour guide. It took Kiva a second to realize what he'd said. I'm sorry, what? Your boyfriend felt bad about leaving you, Calden informed her, wiping a speck of dust off his training shirt. So he asked me to entertain you while he's gone. Show you the city, introduce you to the best of Valenia, that kind of thing. The pain fled Kiva as dread took hold. That's really not necessary, quickly she added, and he's not my boyfriend. Calden waved a hand. Semantics. Seriously, Kiva said, I'm fine keeping my own company. Be that as it may, I made my cousin a promise, Calden said, collecting her wooden sword and nudging her toward the training yard exit. Until Jaren returns, you and I will be spending some quality time together. Lots and lots of quality time. With another easy grin and a quick wink, he finished, Consider me your new best friend, sunshine. Where you go, I go. Doesn't that sound fun? For the next few days, Kiva couldn't sneeze without Calden being close enough to offer her a handkerchief. Each morning, they continued their training, with Kiva only surviving the new sword practice thanks to heavy doses of Rescinda's pain-killing muscle relaxant. As soon as Calden declared their sessions over, he barely gave her enough time to clean up and change before he was upholding his promise to Jaren by whisking her off into the city. Kiva didn't have a spare second to even try to sneak away, and while she'd experienced no further magic bursts in that time, she was increasingly aware of the power lurking beneath her skin. Like a whispered reminder that it was there, and it wanted out. Recalling how her mother had apparently used little magics, Kiva wondered if doing the same might help keep hers from bursting free. But the fear of discovery kept her from any such attempt, and she cast the thought from her mind. When Saturday morning arrived, 5 days since Jaren's departure, Kiva was desperate enough to hatch a drastic plan. Jaren had said he'd be away for 4 days, possibly more, and that meant he could return at any time. And when he did, along with Nari and Captain Verus, it would be so much harder for her to leave the city undiscovered. During her brainstorming, she'd considered using Silverthorn as an excuse again, just like when she'd snuck away to Oak Hollow. But with Calden shadowing her steps, she knew he would only follow her. Even so, Kiva had decided that the Academy would still help her evade the prince, if in another, more extreme way. The first part of her plan began when she finished her morning training, and Calden revealed the places he planned to take her that day, starting with the Temple of the Forgotten Gods, then heading over to the Singing Gardens. After that, they would take a dip in the Sarana's baths, and finish with a hike up the Warrior's Steps to catch the sun setting over the city. Kiva felt tired just thinking about it all, and she used that emotion to turn pleading eyes on him to say, Do you mind if we stop at Silverthorn on our way? I want to pick something up. Are you being vague on purpose? Calden asked, running his fingers along the wooden sword. Kiva placed her hands on her hips and shamelessly lied. I was trying to spare you the details, but since you're such a busybody, I have cramps and want to grab some moonflower. Calden frowned. You should have told me earlier. I would have gone easier on you if I'd have known you were in pain. I'm in pain every morning with you, Kiva returned, feeling a sliver of guilt at his unanticipated compassion. You've never cared before. That's different, he said, and you know it. If Kiva had been suffering from her monthly cycle, she might have been emotional enough to hug him. Instead, she'd swallowed her gratitude and agreed to meet him after she'd bathed. The second part of her plan took place when they arrived at Silverthorn. with Kiva loosing a relieved breath at seeing Lucinda sitting on the same bench as the first time she'd sought the healer out. "Do you mind giving me a moment with her?" Kiva asked Cowden, gesturing toward Ress. I just want to talk to her about some of my, symptoms." The prince seemed surprised by her fake embarrassment, and she swore inwardly, realizing that, as a healer, she should have been perfectly at ease talking about all bodily functions. Thankfully, Cowden let it go and halted on the path, leaning against one of the stone arches to wait. Kiva hurried straight over to Lucinda, who stood upon her approach. "What's with the royal bodyguard?" she asked, tossing her ashy braid over her shoulder. "Not a bodyguard. More like a well-meaning but frustratingly clingy babysitter." Kiva shook her head. "Never mind about that. I need your help. Can you take me to the apothecary's garden?" Lucinda didn't waste time asking questions. "Sure, it looks like you're in a rush. We can cut straight across the sanctuary." Kiva turned to Cowden, miming that she would be back in a few minutes. Part of her was surprised that he didn't follow when she and Ress set out across the grass, but then she reminded herself that she wasn't a prisoner. Cowden was spending the day with her to keep her company, something that he thought she would want, that Jaren thought she would want. At any other time, she would have been humbled by their thoughtfulness, and for the hours Cowden was sacrificing to show her the beautiful city. "Want to tell me what's going on?" Ress asked casually, as they crossed a narrow brook and passed through a small grove of citrus trees, hints of orange, lime, and lemon scenting the air. "I need to ask a favor, but I don't want you to get in trouble," Kiva answered. Ress snorted. "Please. Do I seem like the kind of person who worries about trouble?" No, she didn't. And that was why Kiva had come to her for help. "I need to get away from Valenia for the day." "Back to Oak Hollow?" Ress asked as they headed toward an impressive greenhouse. It hadn't been part of Kiva's tour the first day, when she'd seen only the apothecary's workroom, where the medicines were made and ready for collection. Not Oak Hollow, somewhere else. As much as Kiva was growing to value Ress's friendship, she still had many secrets that couldn't be shared, but the healer didn't press and only asked, "What do you need?" Kiva quickly explained about Cowden dogging her steps and how she needed to take him out of the equation, finishing with, "I'm thinking a sleeping remedy, perhaps a combination of Moradine and Roseron. Normally she would only use Moradine, like what the Queen had given Tip the night of Kiva's abduction, but the addition of Roseron would ensure a deep sleep for a fully grown adult, like Cowden." "That should definitely work," Ress said, without a hint of judgment. They reached the outer edge of the apothecary's garden, and a small picket fence hedging numerous rows of medicinal plants. Had she the time, Kiva would have spent hours wandering the aisles and exploring the greenhouse at the center. But today wasn't a day for sightseeing. "Where to?" Kiva asked Ress, indicating the large garden. The healer hesitated, and Kiva wondered if she was having second thoughts about helping her steal from the academy, but then Ress stepped over the small fence, striding with purpose toward a mounted signpost. Seeing it, Kiva realized she could have left Ress out of her plan entirely, since the sign offered a detailed map of every bed in the garden. "Moradine and Roseron, right?" Lucinda asked. "Right," Kiva confirmed. Ress searched the map, found them both listed in the same garden bed, and led the way to their direction. "So you plan to drug Prince Cowden and then sneak away from the palace to some unknown place?" the healer said as they wandered along the path. "Sounds wise. I'm visiting family," Kiva said. "I thought you did that already." "Different family." "As long as my aiding and abetting doesn't result in you getting hurt," Ress said. "Or lost. Where are you headed?" Kiva bit her lip as they approached the desired garden bed, realizing that she'd forgotten to consult a map. "Blackwater Bog. Do you know it?" "Oh sure, that's just up north a bit," Ress said, and they came to a halt on the path. "Where the wild meadow meets the crueling swamplands," Kiva recited. The healer turned to look at her, squinting. "You have no idea where you're going, do you?" Kiva sighed and shook her head. Rest chuckled. Don't worry, it's really easy to find. Just head north out of Valenia and follow the signposts. You only have to skate the eastern edge of the wild meadow, not travel through the middle of it, so it's a fast journey. Quite quickly, she warned, but don't go beyond Blackwater Bog. The swamp will swallow you alive. Kiva shuddered. Kiva shuddered at the thought. Thanks, she said, fully aware that she owed Lucinda big time. The healer shrugged away her gratitude and pointed to the flower bed. Here we are. Kiva crouched and plucked a few bright red moradine petals, along with some yellow-streaked leaves from the rhododendron shrub. Perfect. Aware that Cowden could come looking for it at any time, which was also why she didn't try to take off without him, since there would be hell to pay if he discovered her gone. Kiva hurried with Lucinda out of the garden and across the sanctuary again. When they reached the prince, he sent a flirtatious smile to Ress, which she ignored, and asked Kiva if she was ready to go. Can we head back to the palace quickly first? She replied after saying goodbye to Ress, following the next phase of her plan. I'm wearing new boots and they're rubbing, and I don't want to end up with blisters. The prince showed no signs of impatience, instead agreeing that she needed appropriate footwear given how much walking their day would require. Nerves skittered in Kiva's stomach when they arrived at her sitting room, the most challenging task now before her. Why don't you take a seat? Kiva said, motioning to an armchair near the window. I may be a few minutes. Cowden followed her suggestion, clearly not in a rush, though he did say, just grab your first comfortable pair. Instead of heading straight to her bedroom, Kiva drifted over to a tea tray the palace servants kept warm at all hours of the day. With shaking hands, she poured 2 cups, carefully slipping the moradine petals and rosarion leaves out of her pocket and dunking them into Cowden's tea, pushing them to the bottom. After spending weeks with him at the Winter Palace, one of the few things she knew was that he was very fond of his morning tea. Praying that today would be no different, she turned with a bright smile and walked over to hand him a teacup. We could have gotten something while we were out, Cowden said, accepting the steaming offering. I was planning to show you this cute little tea house on the way to the temple. It's owned by an ex-apothecary, and it looks like half the florists have relocated into her store. I figured you might like to see it, but I guess we can always stop there on the way back. He raised the teacup to his lips, and Kiva had to stop herself from knocking it out of his hands. Jaren may have asked Cowden to show her around the city, but it was Cowden who had spent time carefully deciding where to take her based on her interests. She hated repaying his kindness by drugging him, even if she'd been left with little choice. Cowden smacked his lips after his first sip. This tastes different. Kiva's heart skipped a beat until he gave in a deep sniff and asked, Did you add cinnamon? He took another large gulp as he waited for her answer, but the potent sleeping mixture took effect before she could reply. Kiva had never worked with moradine or rosarion before, neither having been part of her mediocre garden at Zalendorf, though her father had taught her how to administer both. She'd given Cowden a large enough dose to knock him out for hours, confident there would be no ill effects aside from grogginess and disorientation upon his waking, which would only work in her favour. She hadn't, however, expected the drugs to kick in so fast, and she had to lunge forward to grab him when he nearly toppled out of the armchair. Both his teacup and hers crashed to the ground, spilling brown liquid everywhere. But Cowden was out, and that was what mattered. He would be safe in her sitting room. Tip would be in the Western Palace studying with Oriel until early evening, and any servants who entered would just assume the prince was taking a nap. When Cowden awoke, Kiva hoped he'd think the same, but if he had doubts, she would be back long before the drugs left his system, giving her plenty of time to convince him that he'd dozed off while waiting for her to change her boots. Making sure the prince was comfortable, Kiva quickly cleaned up the mess, then hurried to grab her travel cloak. Just as she was about to leave the door to the hallway, just as she was about to leave, the door to the hallway opened, and Tip skipped through it, his face brightening at the sight of Kiva, but then he saw Cowden passed out in the armchair, the spilled tea slowly drying on the floor. Tip wasn't a fool. It took him less than 2 seconds to take in everything, including Kiva's travel clothes, and the startled look on her face, and turned to her with accusing eyes. What did you do? Kiva raised her hands. It's not what it looks like. It looks like you drugged Calden. Wincing, Kiva admitted. I didn't think you'd be back until later. I needed a sweater. We're heading out into the gardens and it's going to rain soon. Kiva had noticed the clouds while walking back from Silverthorn, but she wasn't about to let poor weather disrupt her day. Now tell me what you're doing, Tip demanded. His hands on his hips. Aware that he'd worked in Zalendorf's infirmary long enough to recognize that Calvin's state wasn't natural, Kiva settled on a half-truth. He's been watching me like a hawk since Jaren left. I just need some space. So you drugged him? He's been nothing but kind to us. All of his family have been nothing but kind. And now you could go and do this? His voice rose. Why, Kiva? Kiva used the guilt she was feeling in an attempt to sway Tip, sharing another partial truth. There's someone I need to visit, and I didn't want him coming with me. Who? It was a risk, Kiva knew, but she trusted the young boy to keep her secrets if she asked him. Some secrets, at least, not all of them. And so she said in a whisper, My family. Tip's anger vanished. Your what? I have a brother and sister living just outside the city, Kiva answered, thinking it safer to share about Zulika and Tor, rather than offer any mention of Delora. Her siblings were well hidden and desired to stay that way, whereas her grandmother was a wild card. I want to go and see them. Tip's freckled brow furrowed. Calden could have taken you. I haven't seen them in 10 years, Kiva said, lying now. She made her lip wobble, not difficult considering how dreadful she felt. I don't know if they want to see me after everything, and if they turn me away, I'd like to lick my wounds in private. That's why I want to go alone, quietly she finished. He's only sleeping. Tip was looking between her and Calden, deep in thought. This is important to you, isn't it? Kiva nodded. More than I can say. That, at least, was the truth. The young boy remained silent for another minute before finally nodding. I'll cover for you. Kiva blinked with surprise, but Tip wasn't finished. He headed toward his bedroom, talking to her the whole way. Everyone thinks he's with you today anyway, so I'll keep Ori out of here, and if anyone asks, I'll say Cal was out late last night and he's sleeping it off. Tip returned to the sitting room carrying a pillow and blanket, carefully draping the latter over the prince and lifting his head for the former. If he wakes before you return, he won't, Kiva said. I'll be quick. If he does, Tip continued, I'll tell him you thought he might be sick, and you left him to rest. Kiva's eyes welled with gratitude. You won't say anything about where I'm going? I get the feeling you'd like it kept secret. Kiva was too choked to do anything other than nod. If it's important to you, it's important to me, Tip said quietly, walking over to wrap his arms around her waist. We're in this together, Kiva. Always. She pulled him close and only released him when he started to squirm, after which he sent her a gap-toothed grin and pushed her toward the door. Needing no further encouragement, Kiva hurried outside and headed directly to the stables. Calden had taken her out on horseback for 2 of the last 3 days, so the royal's grooms didn't ask questions when she politely requested they saddle her a mount. Within minutes she was trotting along the path, waving to the guards as she passed through the front gates and riding out into the city. Only then did she breathe a sigh of relief, turning north to finally seek out her grandmother. Okay. This tickle in my throat is being very annoying. 216. Yay, we're halfway through. Alright, well, thank you everybody for watching. I'll probably just... Oh, I have an annoying cough now. But yeah, I will just finish up there. And we should be back with Skievers Idle Book Club next week where we continue the story and see what happens. Otherwise, I will possibly see you on Sunday night for another Novak and Skievers play Minecraft stream, and then Sharky will be back on Monday for his usual stream. So, thank you everybody for watching and for listening, and hope you have a good week, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye!